Hello, Professor. We can begin in a few minutes. Can you hear me? Professor Ngozi? Hello. Professor Ngozi, you please unmute your voice.
Sorry, I can hear you. Can you hear me as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Great. So we'll wait for another 2 minutes and then we will begin. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we can begin now. Professor Ngozi, Professor Ngozi is from the Department of Public Law at the Faculty of Law, University of Benin in Nigeria. She has earned her PhD in International Environmental Law, Policy and Ethics from Leicester University, UK. She also had done Diploma in International Environmental Law from Geneva. She has been working for last 13-14 years as the expert and the professor of the environmental law, environmental ethics, and environmental policies. In the past, she was the Environmental Policy Research Fellow at the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. She used to be associated with IUCN, with the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. And she has been editor with the reputed journals. And of course, she is the Honorable Deputy Editor-in-Chief with one of our journal, which is Environmental Law and Policy. So she has been active in many other platforms of the United Nations, IUCN, USAID, United Nations University, and many more. So she is a fine expert in her field, including the indigenous knowledge systems. She comes from an area where many indigenous communities have been existing. So she used to be very active in this particular field, not only academically, but also with certain practices. So having this legacy, we invite her for this lecture, and she had agreed amid her very tight schedules. So today she will enlighten all of us with this particular rare field and very important field of the knowledge. So I hand over this platform and forum to her. She is with us and we welcome her. Please, Professor Ngozi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hasrat. I don't think anybody would have done a better introduction of me, actually. And I probably would have been able to do one better than that by myself. But I would just like to emphasize that my bias, my research bias over the years has been that of thinking with Indigenous people. Thinking with Indigenous people in the sense that I would like to know more about their interaction with nature, why they interact with nature the way they do, why they draw the kind of conclusions that they draw from their interactions with nature, and how we can connect these conclusions to solve existing global problems. Now, I would quickly say here that this is not to romanticize Indigenous knowledge, actually, but more to show that it's a path that has been mostly forgotten by a lot of us policymakers, researchers, and so on and so forth. So we are projecting the important aspects of Indigenous knowledge, and that's what my research focus has been on for a very long time. So today, I'm going to look at one aspect of that research just to show you what I have been doing. And the topic today, as you can see, is pandemics, the environment, and traditional ecological knowledge. Just trying to move this away. Okay. So I would go into, well, just not taking it for granted that all of us are used to some of these terminologies, but it would be very important for me to explain or to give context to some of these words that are being used. Pandemics, for instance, I mean, I don't think there's anybody, even children, who are not familiar with the term pandemics. I mean, even if it's just in a remote sense of it, or even if it's in the sense of experiencing the impact of it in one way or the other. So we have pandemics, we have traditional ecological knowledge. Some people might not be familiar with what it is. Again, some others might know it remotely. But the general objective of this lecture today is to show that we have been forced to move to a direction of planetary health, the health of the globe, the health of the earth, the health of nature. We are being forced in that direction. Now, what strategies have we been deploying to achieve this objective? Are the strategies short-term? Are the strategies sustainable? Are the strategies effective, good enough, or not? And if not, what other things do we need to do? How do we need to redirect our steps? So before we go into all of that, we want to look at some very quick facts. I have already said that the objective is to achieve planetary health. So the right to health is well established as a fundamental right of every human being. And this is in the Constitution of the World Health Organization of 1946. Biodiversity is at the heart of the intricate web of life on Earth and processes essential to its survival. The Earth's biological resources are not only shaped by natural evolutionary processes, but they are also increasingly transformed by anthropogenic activities. That is the activities of us human beings. And we'll give examples of these activities soon. They are transformed by anthropogenic activities, population pressures, and globalizing tendencies. Now, when human activities threaten these resources or the complex ecosystems of which they are part, they pose potential risk to millions of people whose livelihoods, health, and well-being are sustained by them, as we have seen over the years, or we have continued, and we are going to continue to see if the right measures are not put in place. Now, the increasingly complex global health challenges that we face, and this includes poverty, malnutrition, infectious diseases, and the growing burden of non-communicable diseases, are more intimately tied than ever to the complex interactions between ecosystems, people, and socio-economic processes. So we're beginning to draw the linkages between what we do, our socio-economic processes, and the state of the ecosystems. Now to the terminologies that we are going to be interfacing with. Pandemics. A pandemic moves from a state of an epidemic to a pandemic, of course. So an epidemic is, you find it in a particular location, you find it in a community, you find it in a state, you find it in a country, and looks like it's going to be contained in that particular geographical region. But by the time it's not able to be contained and it begins to span or transcend through the regions, through communities, from one region, Africa, to communities in Asia, to communities in America, to communities in Australia, and so on and so forth, as we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, then it becomes a pandemic because, at the beginning of the outrage of COVID-19, it was speculated at first that it was an epidemic. But no sooner, than had it been called an epidemic, was it now called a pandemic, because it started moving from China to other regions of the world. Now, zoonotic diseases. A zoonotic disease is an infectious disease that is transmitted between species, from animals to humans, or from humans to animals. Now, that is the loop within which zoonotic diseases occur. It moves from animals to humans, or it moves from humans to animals. Let's see how this has panned out with the COVID-19. Now, for planetary health will connote that human well-being over long term depends on well-being of the earth, including both its living and its non-living systems, its biotic and non-biotic elements. Now, I have put there Ubuntu. I'm sure a lot of us have heard it at one time or the other, Ubuntu, the East African ideology Ubuntu, which connotes that no man lives in isolation of a community. Every person is a part of a community, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in America, whether you're in Asia, whatever continent of the world you are part of a community. And this has been expanded to include the relationship between humans and nature. So when we say a person is part of a community, we're not just referring to a human is part of a human community alone. We are now saying that a human is part of a natural, a community of nature. That's a picture you have right here on the right. Humans are part of a community of nature. So if anything happens to that community, then it is detrimental to the well-being of humans. So if anything happens right within this community here, then it is detrimental to us as human beings. That is where we are going, planetary health. So it is important to keep the nature in a state of health, in a state of wholeness, and that will largely impact our own state of well-being and wholeness, and vice versa. If anything happens to the state of well-being of the earth, then everything is going to happen to us, as we are beginning to see with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what is the relationship between this planetary health and SDGs? Now, the planetary health considerations are they are at the heart of the SDGs. The dual challenges of biodiversity loss and rising global health burdens are not only multifaceted and complex, so it's not just about the complexity, but it's the fact that they also transcend sectoral, disciplinary, and cultural boundaries and demand far-reaching, coherent, and collaborative solutions. Very, very crucial. So what this means is that we have moved from a point of isolating our strategies, isolating solutions to global problems. We have moved beyond this culture, this sector, this discipline, to everybody coming together to bring in your input on how to strategize to achieve this goal, in this case, planetary health. So now the linkage between zoonosis and pandemics is this. Emerging infectious diseases, most of which are considered zoonotic, like we explained in origin, continue to exact a significant toll on society, as is not strange to us. The origins of major human infectious diseases are reviewed and the factors underlying disease emergence explored. Now, anthropogenic changes, which I mentioned earlier, are implicated in the apparent increased frequency of emergence and re-emergence of zoonosis in recent decades. Special emphasis is placed on the pathogen with likely the greatest zoonosic potential, which is the influenza virus. If you look through all the history of zoonosis, if you look through the history of pandemics, you will find this influenza virus is largely implicated in most of them. Whatever pandemic has existed from the past until now, it comes from one influenza virus or the other. So this is just to explain the relationship between zoonosis and COVID-19, where the coronavirus came from, really. We mentioned earlier that zoonotic diseases, of which the coronavirus is one, emerges from a relationship or an over-interaction between humans and animals or between animals and humans. So when there's where there's a breach, there's actually supposed to be a gap between humans and animals in terms of their habitat system is constructed. But once that breach, once that gap is broken, how would I put it now? There's supposed to be a space between humans and animals. So once that space has been interjected, once that space has been interfered with, and humans come too much in close contact with animals, then this interface is what brings rise or gives rise to zoonotic diseases such as the coronavirus. So we have breached the gap between that is meant to exist naturally between humans and animals. And this is the result that we have. Now, zoonosis and COVID-19, clearly, whether its origin, like we have been told, is from a bat or is from a pangolin, the coronavirus outbreak has killed tens of thousands of people and turned the world upside down. And we're still trying to come out of the woods, even if in other places we're hearing that there are new strains of the virus, even if they are not fatal strains, but they are strains all the same. So it has turned the world upside down. It is human activity that enabled the virus to jump to people, like we explained before, and specialists are warning that if nothing changes, many other pandemics of this nature will follow. Unfortunately, sad to say that the coronavirus pandemic is not the last of the pandemics. It's only showing us that there was things to come if the strategies that we are still deploying remain the same. If we keep avoiding addressing things from the roots and just go in the air, like I would say, or trying to deploy short-term measures on symptoms and not the causes. Now, these are a few facts on zoonosis and planetary health. I'll just take a few of them. Nearly 2/3 of human infectious diseases arise from pathogens shared with wild or domestic animals, always animals, bridging the space between humans and animals. The third, anthropogenic practices such as changes in land use and extractive industry actions, animal production systems, and widespread antimicrobial applications affect zoonotic disease transmission. Still anthropogenic practices. Number 5, ecological, evolutionary, social, economic, and epidemiological mechanisms affect zoonosis persistence and emergence, and they are not well understood. Such information would actually inform evidence-based policies, practices, and targeted zoonotic disease surveillance and prevention and control efforts. So what this does, so what the existence of these zoonotic diseases and the pandemics that come out of them do is that they present an opportunity for all hands to be on deck. For example, a lot of things are still unknown about the emergence of zoonotic diseases and the impact that they have on planetary health. So these things that are unknown present an opportunity for evidence-based research, for instance. Now, lastly, we see that multi-sectorial collaboration among clinicians, public health scientists, ecologists, disease ecologists, veterinarians, economists, and others is very, very critical. Like I said earlier, we cannot afford to make it look like, okay, one sector or one discipline or one culture or one region should be in charge of handling or should be in charge of drawing up policies. The clinicians should come, ecologists, they should come together with the veterinarians, they should come together with the economists, they should come together with the communities, with people who are actually custodians of the knowledge of nature over generations, and that's where we're going. So it is everybody coming together to bring up policies that will take us in the direction of planetary health. Now, this is where we're going, a planetary health policy. What is the possibility of it, and how can we achieve a viable planetary health policy? There's need to re-examine how existing systems are structured, how they are resourced, how they are managed to create synergies between animal and human health, and in the process, reduce the effect of zoonotic disease burdens, of course. This process requires an evidence base to effectively, systematically, and strategically inform policy development. This is just to re-emphasize what I have been saying in the last few minutes. So now, what are the next steps? I mean, what do we want to do? How do we go about achieving this big objective that I'm talking about? I have talked about bringing people, everybody on board, bringing all the necessary stakeholders on board. I've talked about short-term plans. I've talked about how the strategies that we are deploying are not very effective, how they are not really sustainable, and so on and so forth. So what am I suggesting? What am I proposing? What are the next steps that we should be looking at taking? Now, let us imagine that the interpretation of COVID-19 pandemic in the foregoing sections is correct. Let us also imagine that the coronavirus is nature's warning, her way of telling us that we've gone too far and must alter our behavior lest we risk further contamination. What then should we do? What does humanity need to do to institute a new policy of peaceful coexistence between humans and nature? Now, this approach would legitimize the continued presence of numbers of humans on the planet, but require that they respect certain limits in their interactions with the ecosphere. It cannot therefore be overemphasized that beyond the essential response to each pandemic, we must begin to rethink our model in harmony with nature. So by necessary implication, this means that there have been models. There are several models, but the models that existing are not quite those that, excuse me, encourage harmony between humans and nature, the kind of harmony that we need to achieve planetary health. If you cast your mind back to that image which I showed earlier about man as a part of the biotic environment, man as a part of the eco community, we will see that we cannot do without enhancing that relationship between man, humans, and the environment. Now we continue with the next step. Here it just emphasizes the importance of that harmonious relationship between humans and environment and the role of Gaia, the Gaia hypothesis. So that harmony with nature proposition, that harmony with nature proposal is actually fostering the notion between the ideology of the Gaia hypothesis. Now, this is where we are coming to. We're talking a lot about traditional ecological knowledge. What is traditional ecological knowledge? I mean, who are the traditional people and what is their ecological knowledge that is different from what we are already deploying? Now, these indigenous people or these ancient original are people who have had interactions with nature over the years, over generations. You know, they have interacted with nature, they have understood nature, they have respected nature, they have seen themselves as worked for them. So we see that indigenous people actually understand that consciousness and feelings are not only human attributes, but the whole of nature is active, it is animate, it is viewed with spirit or consciousness, plants, animals, rivers, lakes, mountains, the wind, sun, and moon. Respect for nature is inherent in these people, and it is rooted in their intimate relationship and understanding of nature's living processes and participants. Indigenous people actually derive their customary laws, recognizing that we humans need to comply with the laws of nature for the well-being of all. Now, this is also emphasizing that relationship that I emphasized, the relationship that I talked about between humans and nature. Now, the worldview of indigenous people is reflected in Earth system science, which recognizes the unity of all life on Earth as a living organism and obliges human beings to understand, to participate, and to cooperate with our source of life, emphasizing again the relationship between humans and nature. Essentially, an indigenous person's sense of self is not separate from land at all. He sees himself as part of land, as part of nature, and not apart from nature. This interconnectedness with nature and the natural world is a lived experience. Indigenous persons have been themselves without this relationship to their homeland. The vital knowledge of generations has taught them how to live with nature and be in balance and harmony with the natural world. Now, I have always been curious as to what this balance is, as to the impacts of this balance on their lifestyles and on their relationship with nature, and how nature has actually panned out as a result of this balance. Are we then saying that we are going to take or adopt TEKs, as they're usually called, traditional ecological knowledge, as against scientific knowledge or mainstream science, which already exists? I mean, is that actually the implication of all of this? Are we going to take one above the other? Are we going to substitute this for the other? You see, it is by no so, because TEK can not only add to an existing body of scientific knowledge, but it also presents a completely different picture of reality, especially when held within a different cosmological and ethical framework. When knowledge about the consequences of management is scarce, these alternative narratives can be of great value. The demonstrated complementarity between traditional and scientific sources of information has validated the use of TEK in ecological research. We're going to see examples of how this has been done. So this is not the first time that TEK is being proposed. TEK has actually been tested, it has been deployed, and the effectiveness has been seen. It hasn't been seen in isolation from mainstream science to make a very, very balanced outcome for ecological research. Now, here in the next two slides, we show the differences with TEK and mainstream science side by side. But I will just mention only one of them. And the first one is that mainstream science actually operates by taking things apart and analyzing the pieces, as against the combination measures of the TEK. Now, this reductive process has produced enormously important technological and medical advances, of course. Because of the scientific method, mainstream science appears able to control the environment and provide greater human comfort, and its successes sometimes make it appear infallible. Now, sometimes make it appear infallible, it is an infallibility. But you see, this taking things apart, this reductive process is not actually helpful for a progressive relationship between humans and nature. On the other hand, traditional science or traditional ecological knowledge operates by observing the whole and the interaction of the parts. This method, also an organized belief system, has sustained native peoples and cultures for millennia against nearly overwhelming odds. But because of this worldview, traditional peoples often find themselves ill-prepared to protect their own best interests. We shall see reasons so later. So this is still emphasizing the reliance on traditional ecological knowledge, how mainstream science on one hand advertently or inadvertently separates humans from nature because of the system of science. You know, it is systematic actually, and it is reductive in its approach. On the other hand, traditional ecology is holistic. There have actually been steps to restore land, community, and health. Several measures have been deployed. Now, even the UN Biodiversity Summit held in September 2020 is an example. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is another example. All of these agree that Indigenous people should be engaged in arresting biodiversity loss. Excuse me. Now, the question is, how did they arrive at this? I mean, why did they suddenly begin to agree that Indigenous people should be engaged, because they have engaged certain kinds of research to see that where indigenous people actually live, biodiversity is better preserved. So there's this evidence that exists. Several other reports have come out outside of this. And so because of these reports, because of this research that people have engaged in, they have called for scaling up solutions, including expanding protected areas and strengthening the role of indigenous people in biodiversity strategies because of evidence. Now, all of these have found out one of the main reasons the world has failed to meet its biodiversity targets is the local communities make to conservation. So the question that should now arise here is, if there is this realization, why are things still very slow to engaging indigenous knowledge? Why are things still very slow in bringing indigenous people to the table to get their ideas, to get their strategies, to deploy their ideologies, to test them and see how they work? And if they do work, how can they be upscaled? After all of this realization, why are things still slow? So I already mentioned the United Nations report, but one thing that I think I should mention here is the Article 8J of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Is a very common provision which is referred to when indigenous knowledge and their deployment are raised. Now, Article 8J largely provides for the respect, the preservation and maintenance of knowledge, innovations and practices of indigenous and local communities, embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and for the promotion of their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge. It also provides for the innovations and practices and the encouragement of the equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of such knowledge, innovations, and practices. Now, and so on and so on. And this includes Article 17.2, Article 18.4, the ICHI Target 18, the IPBES reports that I already mentioned, and so on. So all of this is showing indigenous knowledge is not just recognized in the air, it's actually documented as impactful, it's actually documented as effective. So for emphasis, given that research is conclusive on the fact that nature is declining less rapidly on lands that indigenous manage than in other areas. This is from the IPBES report of 2019, and that their knowledge systems and institutions must have something significant to contribute to current policies, of course. For emphasis, deforestation rates are significantly slower in places where indigenous people securely hold land. When indigenous people have communal control of land, biodiversity loss is noticeably less. This suggests that it is the land management practices from their ideological communities that are keeping species numbers high. Therefore, collaborating with indigenous land stewards will likely be essential in ensuring that species survive and thrive to promote planetary health. That is in summary. So here, before I go into ways that indigenous knowledge can be deployed, before I go into how we can engage TEK more, I'd like to give evidence, a little evidence, of show examples of how TEK and mainstream science have come together to try to solve global ecological problems. Now, one of them is the Indigenous weather forecasting for climate resilience in East Africa. There you have, excuse me, TEK and mainstream science coming together to address issues like the direction of the wind, the star-moon alliance. So this direction of the wind and the star-moon alignment is actually an ideology, or is actually a practice from indigenous knowledge, which mainstream science is now beginning to examine more closely to reach more accurate predictions on weather, more accurate weather forecasting positions. Now, I see this as a very tremendous compliment. I see this as a very important partnership, because it only shows that one part or one group of stakeholders is not a repository of knowledge. So when I am here with my knowledge that I have, and you are here with your system, then we can come together, have a stronger balance, and have a stronger force in addressing an existing problem. This is something I think should be upscaled. The second example, and a very important example at that, is in the Pacific Islands. In the Pacific Islands, you have methods like seasonal bans. You have sacred sites, or these sites are designated for indigenous people. You cannot come and carry out any deforestation activities on this part. The community marine protection, practically known as locally managed marine areas, are this thing for very, very good reasons. They're interesting in the sense that, like I mentioned, when we were talking about the slide of moving towards planetary health, where everybody needs to come together to put heads together on how to go about achieving the solutions or achieving planetary health. So under LLMA, what happens is that communities, government representatives, NGOs, researchers, all of these people come together to look for ways that marine areas can be better protected. And they are basing these protection strategies on the local knowledge. Our system has thrived so much that the World Wide Fund for Nature is very happy to support it, because they have seen the impact on the small scale. They are supporting it for the larger scale, for wider impact. Now, I keep stating this example every time, even if there are several other examples, because of how far or how advanced it has moved and the impact it has had on marine biodiversity in the Pacific Islands. Now, like I keep saying, this should be leveraged over and over again in different places and at different times. Examples on co-policies between traditional ecological knowledge, and in India, the rice fish co-culture in China, the indigenous fire management in Australia, the wilderness area management in Finland, the forest management in Wisconsin, traditional medicinal practice in Brazil, and so on and so forth. Now, examples of this are actually a lot. And I chose them, I put these examples here because they are across continents, so that it doesn't look like, oh, it's just in one small part of the world that traditional ecological knowledge is being complemented with mainstream science. It's just in one small part of the world that it can be effective. No, it can actually be effective across the globe. So essentially, this is what I am saying. Knowledge gained from traditional ecological knowledge practice, situated in the cultural and spiritual context in which it was acquired, has the potential to improve scientific models of ecosystem and human health, to inform policy and decision-making in very, very important ways. So what are the policy directions that we need to take to link TEK and mainstream science for more effectiveness? How do we engage TEK more? How do we bring this indigenous people or indigenous knowledge more to the table? One of the first ways is to integrate biodiversity conservation into health and recreational activities. So health and recreational institutions can actually be sensitized to include biodiversity conservation in their activities, given the reliance of traditional healers on local biodiversity and the reliance of recreational institutions on biodiversity and other natural resources for fundraising. The second is to create conservation awareness. Now, it's very critical to I keep saying that people will not buy what they do not understand. People will not value what they do not respect. We talked about the stewardship ideology of indigenous people. We talked about of fusion, of respect, of kindness between indigenous people and nature. Unless people get to see the importance of this, unless people get to see the critical impact of this, nobody is going to agree to the preservation of nature. Everybody is still going to be inclined towards those anthropogenic activities of trading in animals, land use tenure, and so on and so forth that we mentioned. But people's behaviors will begin to be regulated where their minds become reorientated. So where there's a reorientation of the mind as to this is a better way to deal with nature, or this is a more reason why you should deal with nature this way, or this is the impact of the current activities that you are engaging in nature. And then they begin to shift. You know, Dean Roscoe Pound said law is an instrument of social change. But law cannot be an instrument of social change without the change of mindset. So even if we have policies superimposed saying that indigenous knowledge must be deployed, indigenous knowledge must be taken into consideration, indigenous knowledge must be used to achieve planetary health objectives, it's not going to be as effective as where you get people to understand why that should be. The moment a person understands why it should be, then he is the same person who's going to drive the process to achieve that objective. And that is what makes the objective sustainable. So the creation of conservation awareness is very, very critical. Closely related to that, to the previous slide, is the fact that a lot of people, even I myself, before I began to delve into tea, used to be of the impression that TKs are primitive, backward. I mentioned something about sacred site. I mean, why would you call a site sacred? They should go into a particular fed and so on and so forth. Agreed that some of this can be repugnant to natural justice, equity, and good conscience, but that does not necessarily demonize all of them. If we actually take our time to take on some of this indigenous knowledge, take on some of the elements of the indigenous knowledge, and see the reasons why they believe what they believe, see the reasons why the impact of their knowledge is turned out to be the way it has, then we will understand that, okay, yes, when we bring this indigenous people to the table, we can remove the parts that are contrary to natural justice and take the parts that are actually impactful for this generation and future generations. So essentially, we have to come to a point where systematic studies towards decoding indigenous knowledge and demonization of indigenous knowledge is embedded traditional beliefs, local institutional information by which they can defend some of these beliefs in a more scientific way. So giving scientific justification to indigenous beliefs is a very, very important aspect of deploying traditional ecological knowledge. Gender considerations, very crucial. I think it's common knowledge already that women are very, very important when it comes to natural resource management. Traditional knowledge revealed in forest and fishery management, for instance, can result in better resource governance and conservation outcomes. Women's particular roles and responsibilities within the society lead them to develop unique knowledge related to biodiversity, shaped by their specific needs and priorities. They are thereby in a unique position to bring different perspectives and new solutions to addressing biodiversity concerns. Gender barriers in land tenure reforms, for instance, can be removed or reduced, as this would lead to a significant increase in soil conservation investment by female-headed households. So these have first-hand experience in biodiversity conservation, first-hand experience in natural resource. So they should be able to tell you, oh, this would work, this would not work. Now, this will work because of this factor, and this is not likely to work because of this factor. So it is important to have more opportunities or more openings for gender considerations when it comes to policies on planetary health. Now, supporting decision-making and planning on conservation. Traditional leaders are living institutions themselves. Their sphere of influence is founded and deeply rooted in local culture. Therefore, local informal institutions that persist through the advent of modernization should be tapped and supported to align with formal institutions so that local support is generated for effective natural resources management. Just a reiteration of what we have been saying so far. So we have formal institutions, we have informal institutions. The informal institutions should not be treated as what you call it now, outdated, as barbaric, as no longer useful, but they have their important roles to play in aligning the informal institutions or so-called formal institutions. Government support is very, very critical. Now, government support, whether we like it or not, is what gives legitimacy to some of these activities or strategies that we are talking about. We cannot, by any means, arrive at a solid policy or solid policies for planetary health if we do not have the support of government. So once there's that backing of government, once there's that presence of government, once there's that approval of the interface between the formal and informal institutions by government, we'll discover that it even gives a stronger platform for that existence, which has started to happen in the Pacific Islands, because evidence has been shown that this is working. If everybody comes together, this works. Now we're coming to support this because it is a worthy venture and the government sees reason with you and starts to support. Now, I have moved into my conclusions. For everything that I have been saying over the past virtually an hour or so, is that number one, we invade tropical forests and other wild landscapes, which harbor so many species of animals and plants. And within those creatures, so many unknown viruses. We cut the trees, we kill the animals or cage them and send them to markets. We disrupt ecosystems and we shake viruses loose from their natural host. When that happens, they need a new host. Often we are that new host. Remember I talked about bridging the gap between humans and animals, bridging the gaps between the natural gap, the ecological gap between humans and animals. Once you close that space, then man now unduly interfaces with animals. And the consequence of that is zoonotic diseases. Conclusion number two, tribal and indigenous people's lifestyles can offer modern societies many lessons in the management of resources in complex forests, mountain, and dryland ecosystems. These communities are the repositories of vast accumulation of traditional knowledge and experience that link humanity with its ancient origins. Their disappearance is a loss for the larger society, actually, which could learn a great deal from the traditional skills in sustainably managing very complex ecological systems. Now, this is as far back from the report of our common future of 1987. The final conclusion is that the conservation of a complete and healthy nature is consequently in the interest of humans. That is the essence of what we have been saying, which means that the defenders of nature are also defenders of humanity. On the contrary, those who attack nature, moved by short-sighted human interest, in the end itself, remember the discussion on Ubuntu. Now, this attack on humankind itself is threatening its future together with the future of action, and that's the end of my presentation. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, please, questions are invited. Please come forward. Yes. No question?
No questions.
Yes, please.
So it's either that the lecture was very clear or it wasn't clear at all. So it's really important to have, at some point you want to hear some clarification. The questions I usually get from people is that, are you saying how are indigenous people with their beliefs going to be engaged? I mean, they have different beliefs. Are you going to take their ideas and leave their beliefs away? You know, I mean, how are you going to do that? So the answer to that usually is that the indigenous people are driven by their beliefs. That's what they are. They're driven by their beliefs, and it is their beliefs that actually are responsible for their ideologies. Now, nobody is interested in taking their beliefs with their ideologies. We're interested in how these ideologies work in the preservation of nature. So we're not looking to convince anybody about, I'm not looking to convince anybody about my spirituality. I'm not looking to convince anybody about the traditional ideas or convictions of my forefathers or anything. All I'm looking to do in this context is to show how these systems of interacting with nature have actually helped to preserve biodiversity. And that is all. If you want to be part of the beliefs, that is your business, you know, but the beliefs are not what are crucial when it comes to the policies for the planetary health, even if they are crucial for the indigenous people themselves. So questions, I have asked a question and answered it. So more questions if you have.
So I think we have no question. So let's close this session. You have very nicely, very wonderfully articulated the topic, and you have correlated all the things. I mean, the modern day pandemic issues with how the communities, local communities, especially when coping with these emergency things, and the role of the indigenous knowledge in it. So you have very smartly articulated the things. Yes, we should appreciate that the indigenous knowledge is useful and it is used by the people in all the issues they have been facing contemporarily. So it is not something which is not useful, I mean, in the modern context. So it is, indigenous knowledge is very pertinent, very useful for the communities, those who have been using it. So thank you for enlightening everybody and everybody of us. And you have spared a lot of time behind this topic and lecture. So we are very thankful to you. I think you would have also contribute in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
we officially close this lecture now. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.